MMA back in the early 2010s was picking up a ton of steam. It was, and still is, the fastest growing sport on the planet. And I feel a huge part of this was due to the UFC Undisputed video game series. People underestimate how much influence video games can actually have, as it can be an easy and fun way to be introduced to something. So many things that I currently love, from Dragon Ball Z to Gundam to MMA, were all introduced to me through their video game adaptations. While I was kind of a fan of MMA and the UFC prior to playing Undisputed, it allowed me to consume my favorite sport in a way that I hadn't even thought possible at the time. The Undisputed games sold reasonably well enough to get 2 sequels, a PSP port of one of those sequels, and a competitor in the form of EA Sports MMA. But the thing is that the publisher of the UFC games, THQ, was not doing so hot financially. I won't get super into it, as I don't feel I'm the right person for that kind of video, but it pretty much was the result of overextending. THQ had bought tons of high-profile licenses from SpongeBob SquarePants, WWE, UFC, I think they had Ninja Turtles for a while, all while trying to regularly pump out their own IPs like Saints Row and Darksiders. And a lot of their games, particularly the licensed ones, only did okay at best in terms of sales, usually enough to let them continue paying for the license. But in January of 2013, THQ shut down, and Electronic Arts, a company that Dana White had a personal grudge with, had secured the rights to the UFC license shortly after the release of Undisputed 3. Now this was both good and bad. On one hand, EA pumped tons of money into their sports games. Their Fight Night series, even when they didn't play well, always looked fantastic. And Fight Night Champion was probably the best of the series, so coming off of that, I had decently high hopes on their take on the UFC. Well, in 2014, they finally put out EA Sports UFC, a game that serves not just as a reboot of the UFC video games, but also as a spiritual successor to their surprisingly good MMA game from 2010. But this game is always overshadowed, sandwiched between Undisputed 3 as well as its own sequels. But how did EA do? How is this game? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it downright terrible? Is it on par with Undisputed 3, or maybe it's even better? Nobody knows. I certainly don't, so you know what? Let's find out. The game begins with no intro, nothing, just a title screen. But the disappointment doesn't end there, because EA is the gift that keeps on giving. It keeps going when you realize that this game's bones are incredibly bare. When it comes to the amount of modes, I can count the number on my testicles. You have career, versus, and online. Now it is the year of our Lord 2022 at the time I'm making this, and the online servers are dead. You can no longer play EA Sports UFC 1 online. But you can still play Undisputed 3, providing that you have friends with it, a PS3, and, there's a lot of caveats, but you can still do that in Undisputed 3. But not this game from 2014 that was at one point in time considered cutting edge. As for the roster, it's good, with everyone you expect to be in a UFC game at the time being present and accounted for. You've got the big boys of the time like Brock Lesnar, Alistair Overeem, John Jones, and some classics like Chuck Liddell, Rampage Jackson, Wanderlei Silva. They even included Bruce motherfucking Lee as a guest fighter, and honestly, his inclusion gave me some really mad hype. Bruce Lee is arguably the most influential martial artist of all time. Now, whether or not his skill was legitimate or if he was just an actor is hotly debated. But in all honesty, I won't be discussing that a whole lot. In fact, this is the only amount I'll be discussing it. The fact of the matter is, he inspired a lot of people to take up martial arts, myself included. There's a reason why after his death, a bunch of imitators popped up. He belongs here. I kinda wish they kept going with this motif of putting in actors with martial arts backgrounds. Like, how cool would it be to have Chuck Norris or Jean-Claude Van Damme as guests? Hell, Keanu Reeves has a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Fucking slip him in. Let me have John Wick versus Conor McGregor. Hell, I've said it for years. They should just put Cynthia Rothrock in these games. I mean, UFC 1 was the first MMA game to include female fighters after all, despite what Supremacy MMA might say. Seriously, 2 fighters does not mean you get to put that shit on the back of your box. Nobody said, hot damn, saddle my ass, and call me Susie, I get to play as Felicia Herrig in this dog shit Tekken clone. Mind you, the roster of female fighters is very small, and you can't make female calves, but I'm still glad that they're here, as women's MMA is sorely underrated. For the longest time, Dana White didn't even want to sign women until he saw the dollar signs. But enough about the roster. How does it play? How does this actually feel when you've got it in your system and you are ready to start throwing hands? How does Electronic Arts bring mixed martial arts to the 8th generation of consoles? Well, for one, the graphics are fucking superb. They always make their sports games look fantastic, and this is no exception. I mean, all of the fighters look as close as humanly possible for the time. Just look at Rampage Jackson. Like, I ain't gay, but if he decided to give me the old ground and pound, I'm not gonna say no. Fighters look more realistic than ever, with sweat, blood, and bruises adding loads of realism to the fights. There's even some body morphing when you're on the ground or clinching, making it seem that much more like the real thing. But that's where the glowing praises kind of end. The gameplay is more akin to the speed of EA MMA, with the controls of Undisputed. You have your left and right punches and kicks, but this time around only one button for blocking. You can still do the parry from MMA, but it's often unreliable. I also dislike that things like hooks and head kicks are done with a direction as opposed to a button combination. In Undisputed, the whole forward and punch for hooks worked because the game was slower, more methodical. But in EA MMA, it's faster, and being able to back up while jabbing was a pretty big deal for me. In EA UFC, you have to choose between moving back or throwing an uppercut. And yeah, about that striking, it's okay. I think the worst thing about the striking is just how ineffective it feels. Like, I am fucking pounding Kat Zingano's head here. Like, this shit would chop down fucking Saitama from One Punch Man, and she's just taking it here like a champ. It kind of feels like I'm hitting my opponent with a rubber hammer. Just add some squeaky noises, and that's exactly how the game feels. And yeah, it also kind of devolves into high-stakes rock'em sock'em robots after a bit. And even when gassed, I never really feel like I'm in any danger. That all being said, there are times when the striking feels really damn good. For a split second. When you first get into the ring, ready to throw down, the game very quickly feels like it's going to be amazing. Really fun, it just nails the look and the presentation of mixed martial arts. Then you land an awesome haymaker, it sends your opponent reeling, and you land another, and another, and another, until you realize that you're not really fighting Mark Hunt, but rather one of those bouncy clown punching bags that kinda looks like Mark Hunt. It takes so damn long to knock anyone out in this game. I had a legit 20-minute long slugfest between Brock Lesnar and Roy Nelson, where we were literally recreating that scene from Metal Gear Rising and took it until the end of the 4th to send Big Country to Sleep Country. The knockouts in this game are the highlight of the striking system. That last punch almost always looks satisfying to land, and seeing your opponent's lights dim as your knuckles connect and they stagger back and do like a punch-out style spin before crashing into the mat, it's just as satisfying as ever. I mean, look at this flying knee. Look at it in slow motion. Now look at it upside down! I just killed a man. The issue is that it takes a long time to get there. Every fighter, even ones not known for taking a lot of damage, feel like you're fighting the Terminator, which sounds fucking awesome on paper, but when you actually try it out, not so much. A lot of the time your fights are just you and your opponent standing there and throwing jabs like this was Saint Seiya, and sometimes if you're lucky or unlucky, one of them might end in a knockout. And yeah, the game did go with a control scheme kinda like Undisputed. In Undisputed, you did hooks by pressing forward and punch, and uppercuts with back and punch. This worked there because Undisputed was intentionally slow. A lot of people call it clunky, but it's by design. In a way, it's more akin to playing a From Software game. And everybody loves those, despite the fact that they're also not really all that fun. The developers wanted you to have to commit to strikes before you threw them. Strikes were slow, but weighty, and knockouts happened pretty damn quickly. But EA UFC is more like a Platinum game. It's more like Devil May Cry than Dark Souls, in terms of movement at least. It's meant to be fast and exciting, having you at the edge of your seat, wondering and waiting on when the knockout is finally coming. And waiting. And waiting. And waiting! And there it is! But with the faster movement, this whole forward for hooks and back for uppers doesn't really work well. You need to be able to throw any strike at any moment. You need that freedom. You can't jab while backing up or throw a jab while moving forward to apply pressure. You're either just jabbing or hooking. Kinda like your mom. And while it's not great, it does make for some light, casual fun, and contrary to popular belief, just because a game doesn't have depth or strategy doesn't mean it's not fun. The opposite is also true. That one was for all the Tekken fans watching. That's actually a huge issue I have with fighting game fans as a whole. A lot of the FGC sucks off Tekken because they look at these enormous move lists and think that's depth. Now, Tekken is a deep fighting game. It's one of the deepest, don't get me wrong. But ask any serious Tekken player how much of the move list they actually use, and they won't even tell you half. It's closer to a quarter. In terms of sheer fighting depth, Undisputed 3 has EA UFC beat. That's not to say that is why Undisputed 3 is better, but it's just one of the many reasons. It's also not to say that EA UFC is bad. It's not. It's actually quite good, considering the time it was made, what other MMA games had come out around the time, and just who the developer was. These were the Fight Night guys, and considering only 3 and Champion were any good, I'd say this not being terrible is a step in the right direction. But again, striking is simple to make fun. By nature, punching things is fun. Playing video games is fun. Ergo, punching things in video games should also be fun. So how's the grappling? In a word, confusing. In 2 words, fucking confusing. We made all that progress to Undisputed 3 only for EA to practically piss it away.
I told you, I pissed it away.
Gone is the responsive controls, all the seated cage positions, and most importantly, the fun. And in their place is me screaming at my right analog stick, not quite knowing what directions do what. Yes, I know there's a tutorial, but real men don't need tutorials. Be a man, lose, scream at the TV, and blame the developers for your incompetence. It's what I do, and while it has never worked, I am not changing now. I find I use the "it feels like I'm giving suggestions, but" line a little too often when I'm talking about a control scheme that just doesn't make sense to me. And yeah, a lot of the time it's because I'm a fucking Neanderthal that just talks about Dragon Ball Z and UFC games on the internet. But I really do not know how to describe the control scheme, at least when it comes to the grappling, of EA Sports UFC 1. I guess it's kind of like Undisputed, but if Undisputed is just taking your inputs as suggestions, then EA UFC is just flat out ignoring them. It's kind of like when you play Pokemon and you don't have enough gym badges to make your level 40 Charizard listen to you, but the whole game. Submissions are also kind of confusing to pull off. Subs are done by holding R1 and doing a motion with the right stick, and okay, I have to be on film to say this. Honestly, the submission system's great. I actually really like it. It's simple, but it works, it's effective. And I really like that EA decided to go with something new instead of just trying to copy Undisputed or even reusing things from EA Sports MMA. Man, that's a mouthful. It works, and it provides a certain level of excitement and satisfaction when you're fighting to lock in a hold. Yeah, I said it. I like this game's submission system. It's simple but engaging. You have to prevent your opponent from filling out these segments of the octagon, and when you're ready to progress to the next stage of your submission, you press the left stick in a direction, with each stage getting progressively harder. It works so that submissions aren't just a one-hit win, but rather something you have to actually work for. It's fun and actually satisfying. And it's honestly the one thing this game does a lot better than Undisputed 3 did. Undisputed 3 is the overall much better game, but its submission system was its Achilles heel. It had perfect striking, perfect grappling mechanics that were made even better by having pitch-perfect controls. But the submission system being so incredibly simple really hurt it. It worked, but it felt like kind of a band-aid fix. The submission system in Undisputed always seemed to struggle. And while Undisputed 3 has the best submission system of any of the Yuke's games, it's very clear that they just wanted something that was better than the Shine system of the first two games. But EA's actually has some degree of flow and logic behind it. BJJ is slow and methodical, and you actually have to work for a submission, instead of just playing a game of cat and mouse. It simulates the feeling of actually fighting for control of the opponent's limb in a very satisfying and intuitive way. Real shame that the striking's not quite as polished. Striking, while buttery smooth, lacks any real impact. Punches don't look or feel like they hurt until that very last one that scores the knockout. Grappling just feels awkward, like 7th grade sex ed. It isn't responsive whatsoever, and fights almost always go the distance. It also doesn't help that stamina feels nearly worthless, almost as worthless as the Canadian dollar. I almost always feel like I'm playing with an infinite stamina cheat-on. Your movements use up so little of it, and you recover it so quickly that it never feels like a huge factor in the fight itself. And the last thing I want to discuss is the career mode. Yeah, I initially was just going to not discuss EA UFC 1's career mode. I thought it would be yet another ho-hum menu-based mode where all I did was select training mini-games from a menu and did that for 20 minutes just to get a 5-minute long fight. I was wrong, but not quite dead wrong. See, the career mode in EA UFC is just menus that lead to training minigames, but the minigames are centered around your opponent's fighting style. As a person who has had a few amateur fights under their belt, this is actually pretty similar to the approach fighters take in real life. Your training camp is heavily geared around your next opponent. It's designed to be as efficient as possible so that you can get accustomed to how they fight. And this game replicates that pretty damn well. My main form of praise comes from the fact that everything is a lot quicker than in Undisputed. I'm not spending 20 minutes in menus, I'm spending about half of one. Then it's off to the minigame, which is shorter than most of the minigames found in Mario Party. It's short, concise, and it's to the bloody point. In Undisputed 3, I found myself often slacking on my training because I just wanted to get to the fighting that much faster. But here, I don't need to do that because of how little time is spent not actually fighting. I like this, and sadly, this is the only EA UFC game that takes this approach, with UFC 2 going right back into the mountains of menus. It's also really easy to level up your fighter, as this game gives out experience like fucking candy. And I didn't even have to go into a windowless van just to get it, which is another highlight. The game could definitely use more puppies though. The windowless van it's got them beat in the puppy department. Oh, yeah, you might be wondering why I didn't bring up things like event mode or ultimate fights. I didn't forget about them. Electronic Arts did, because they aren't fucking here. The lack of modes is why I find it hard to go back to this game. It's lacking in nearly every sense. No event mode, no mission modes. Like Ultimate Fights, you have 3 modes. 2 since online is now completely gone. And this brings me to my very last point of ire. A game cannot thrive if online is a major component. Online should only be there to enhance an already good game. Something like Street Fighter V, Tekken, or Smash Bros. Will still be fully playable several decades down the line, because they're enjoyable games and don't rely solely on the online experience. They've got enough meat to stand on their own. But clearly, EA wanted this game's online to be a huge part of the actual experience, which, while fine, it leaves a big chunk of the game entirely inaccessible. If online is a huge focus of your game, keep it up. If your excuse for taking it down is that you want people to buy your new game, make a better new game. It's absolute bullshit that the online for Dead or Alive 4 is not only still up, but actually really active, despite DOA's 5 and 6 existing, yet Electronic Arts, one of the largest companies on Earth, can't maintain their sports games for a few years longer. Dead or Alive 4 is nearly old enough to vote. Thankfully, I only paid $5 Canadian for this game, and for a $5 game, it's fine. It sits on my shelf with the rest of my games, it's not hurting anybody. But now I come to the portion where I wrap things up and answer the question I asked at the very start of the video. How was EA's first shot at UFC? Well, it was decent. And that's it. It's decent. As far as first attempts go, it's not bad. It's not great, it's not amazing, it's not terrible. It's right in the middle. My big issue is that they decided to start from scratch when they should have taken all the stuff that worked from EA Sports MMA and just built off of that. That makes sense, right? Instead, no. They decided to go in an entirely different direction and just do their own thing, which that's fine. The career mode is definitely a step in the right direction, as is the general feel of the game itself. I think if I got this used back in the day, I might have been pretty satisfied. But, and a huge but, as a full-priced game meant to replace Undisputed 3, no. Just no. It's maybe on par with the first Undisputed. Don't get me wrong, it's far from the worst UFC game. Hell, it's not even the worst MMA game ever made. But so far, the series has been sitting at an 8 at worst and a 9 at best. And EA UFC is just a 6 or a 7. Maybe if I'm generous, it's a 7. But just if my generosity is run dry, then it's a 6. Maybe a 6.5. It's a 6.5. There. That's the final number. It's a 6.5. And you know what? I've ragged on it enough. I'm just saying, things could be a whole lot worse. It could have Fortnite dances.